How the first letter was written. Once upon a most early time was a Neolithic man. He was not a Jute or an Angle or even a Dravidian, which he might well have been, best beloved, but never mind why. He was a primitive, and he lived cavily in a cave, and he wore very few clothes, and he couldn't read, and he couldn't write, and he didn't want to, and except when he was hungry, he was quite happy. His name was Tegemai Bopsalai, and that means man who does not put his foot forward in a hurry. But we, O best beloved, will call him Tegemai for short. And his wife's name was Teshemai Tuindro, and that means lady who asks a very many questions. But we, O best beloved, will call her Teshemai for short. And his little girl daughter's name was Taphemai Matulamai, and that means small person without any manners who ought to be spanked. But I am going to call her Taffy. And she was Tegemai Bopsalai's best beloved and her own mummy's best beloved, and she was not spanked half as much as was good for her, and they were all three very happy. As soon as Taffy could run about, she went everywhere with her daddy Tegemai, and sometimes they would not come home to the cave till they were hungry, and then Teshemai Tuindro would say, "Where in the world have you two been to get so shocking dirty? Really, my Tegemai, you're no better than my Taffy." Now attend and listen. One day, Tegemai Bopsalai went down through the beaver swamp to the Wagai River to spear carpfish for dinner, and Taffy went too. Tegemai's spear was made of wood with shark's teeth at the end, and before he had caught any fish at all, he accidentally broke it clean across by jabbing it down too hard on the bottom of the river. They were miles and miles from home. Of course, they had their lunch with them in a little bag, and Tegemai had forgotten to bring any extra spears. "Here's a pretty kettle of fish," said Tegemai. "It will take me half the day to mend this." "There's your big black spear at home," said Taffy. "Let me run back to the cave and ask Mummy to give it me." "It's too far for your little fat legs," said Tegemai. "Besides, you might fall into the beaver swamp and be drowned. We must make the best of a bad job." He sat down and took out a little leather mendy bag full of reindeer sinews and strips of leather and lumps of beeswax and resin, and began to mend the spear. Taffy sat down too, with her toes in the water and her chin in her hand, and thought very hard. Then she said, "I say, Daddy, it's an awful nuisance that you and I don't know how to write, isn't it? If we did, we could send a message for the new spear." "Taffy," said Tegemai, "how often have I told you not to use slang? Awful isn't a pretty word, but it would be a convenience, now that you mention it, if we could write home." Just then a stranger man came along the river, but he belonged to a far tribe, the Tewaras, and he did not understand one word of Tegemai's language. He stood on the bank and smiled at Taffy, because he had a little girl daughter of his own at home. Tegemai drew a hank of deer sinews from his mendy bag and began to mend his spear. "Come here," said Taffy. "Do you know where my mummy lives?" And the stranger man said, being, as you know, a Tewara. "Silly," said Taffy, and she stamped her foot because she saw a shoal of very large carp going up the river just when her daddy couldn't use his spear. "Don't bother grown-ups," said Tegemai, so busy with his spear mending that he did not turn around. "I aren't," said Taffy. "I only want him to do what I want him to do, and he won't understand." "Then don't bother me," said Tegemai, and he went on pulling and straining at the deer's sinews with his mouth full of loose ends. The stranger man, a genuine Tawara he was, sat down on the grass, and Taffy showed him what her daddy was doing. The stranger man thought, "This is a very wonderful child. She stamps her foot at me, and she makes faces. She must be the daughter of that noble chief, who is so great he won't take any notice of me." So he smiled more politely than ever. "Now," said Taffy, "I want you to go to my mummy, because your legs are longer than mine and you won't fall into the beaver swamp, and ask for Daddy's other spear, the one with the black handle that hangs over our fireplace." The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, thought, "This is a very, very wonderful child. She waves her arms and she shouts at me, but I don't understand a word of what she says. But if I don't do what she wants, I greatly fear that haughty chief, man who turns his back on callers, will be angry." He got up and twisted a big flat piece of bark off a birch tree and gave it to Taffy. He did this, best beloved, to show that his heart was as white as the birch bark, and that he meant no harm. But Taffy didn't quite understand. "Oh," said she, "now I see. You want my mummy's living address? Of course I can't write, but I can draw pictures if I've anything sharp to scratch with. Please lend me the shark's tooth off your necklace." The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, didn't say anything. So Taffy put up her little hand and pulled at the beautiful bead and seed and shark-tooth necklace round his neck. The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, thought, "This is a very, very, very wonderful child. The shark's tooth on my necklace is a magic shark's tooth, and I was always told that if anybody touched it without my leave, they would immediately swell up or burst. But this child doesn't swell up or burst, and that important chief, man who attends strictly to his business, who has not yet taken any notice of me at all, doesn't seem to be afraid that she will swell up or burst. I had better be more polite." So he gave Taffy the shark's tooth, and she lay down flat on her tummy with her legs in the air, like some people on the drawing room floor when they want to draw pictures, and she said, "Now I'll draw you some beautiful pictures. You can look over my shoulder, but you mustn't joggle. First I'll draw Daddy fishing. It isn't very like him, but Mummy will know, because I've drawn his spear all broken. Well, now I'll draw the other spear that he wants, the black-handled spear. It looks as if it was sticking in Daddy's back, but that's because the shark tooth slipped, and this piece of bark isn't big enough. That's the spear I want you to fetch, so I'll draw a picture of me myself splaining to you. My hair doesn't stand up like I've drawn, but it's easier to draw that way. Now I'll draw you. I think you're very nice, really, but I can't make you pretty in the picture, so you mustn't be offended. Are you offended?" The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, smiled. He thought, "There must be a big battle going to be fought somewhere, and this extraordinary child, who takes my magic shark's tooth, but who does not swell up or burst, is telling me to call all the great chief's tribe to help him. He is a great chief, or he would have noticed me." "Look," said Taffy, drawing very hard and rather scratchily. "Now I've drawn you, and I've put the spear that Daddy wants into your hand, just to remind you to bring it. Now I'll show you how to find my mummy's living address. You go along till you come to 2 trees. Those are trees. And then you go over a hill. That's a hill. And then you come into a beaver swamp all full of beavers. I haven't put in all the beavers because I can't draw beavers, but I've drawn their heads, and that's all you see of them when you cross the swamp. Mind you don't fall in. Then our cave is just beyond the beaver swamp. It isn't as high as the hills, really, but I can't draw things very small. That's my mummy outside. She is beautiful. She is the most beautifulest mummy there ever was, but she won't be offended when she sees I've drawn her so plain. Now, in case you forget, I've drawn the spear that Daddy wants outside our cave. It's inside, really, but you show the picture to my mommy, and she'll give it you. I've made her holding up her hands because I know she'll be so pleased to see you. Isn't it a beautiful picture? And do you quite understand? Or shall I explain again? The stranger man, and he was a Tawara, looked at the picture and nodded very hard. He said to himself, "If I do not fetch this great chief's tribe to help him, he will be slain by his enemies, who are coming up on all sides with spears. Now I see why the great chief pretended not to notice me. He feared that his enemies were hiding in the bushes and would see him deliver a message to me. Therefore he turned his back and let the wise and wonderful child draw the terrible picture showing me his difficulties. I will away and get help for him from his tribe." He did not even ask Taffy the road, but raced off into the bushes like the wind, with the birch bark in his hand, and Taffy sat down, most pleased. "What have you been doing, Taffy?" said Tegamai. He had mended his spear and was carefully waving it to and fro. "It's a little derangement of my own, Daddy dear," said Taffy. "If you won't ask me questions, you'll know all about it in a little time, and you'll be surprised. You don't know how surprised you'll be, Daddy. Promise you'll be surprised." "Very well," said Tegamai, and went on fishing. The stranger man, did you know he was a Tawara, hurried away with the picture and ran for some miles till quite by accident he found Teshumai Tuandro at the door of her cave, talking to some other Neolithic ladies who had come in to a primitive lunch. Taffy was very like Teshumai, especially about the upper part of the face and the eyes. So the stranger man, always a pure Tawara, smiled politely and handed Teshumai the birch bark. He had run hard, so that he panted, and his legs were scratched with brambles, but he still tried to be polite. As soon as Teshumai saw the picture, she screamed like anything and flew at the stranger man. The other Neolithic ladies at once knocked him down and sat on him in a long line of 6, while Teshumai pulled his hair. "It's as plain as the nose on this stranger man's face," she said. "He has stuck my Tegamai all full of spears, and frightened poor Taffy so her hair stands on end, and not content with that, he brings me a horrid picture of how it was done. Look!" She showed the picture to all the Neolithic ladies sitting patiently on the stranger man. "Here is my Tegamai with his arm broken. Here is a spear sticking into his back. Here is a man with a spear ready to throw. Here is another man throwing a spear from a cave. And here are a whole pack of people." They were Taffy's beavers, really, but they did look rather like people, "coming up behind Tegamai. Isn't it shocking?" "Most shocking," said the Neolithic ladies, and they filled the stranger man's hair with mud, at which he was surprised, and they beat upon the reverberating tribal drums and called together all the chiefs of the tribe of Tegamai, with their hetmans and dalmans, all Nagusses, Woons, and Akuns of the organization, in addition to the warlocks, Angakoks, Juju men, Bonzes, and the rest, who decided that before they chopped the stranger man's head off, he should instantly lead them down to the river and show them where he had hidden poor Taffy. By this time, the stranger man, in spite of being a Tawara, was really annoyed. They had filled his hair quite solid with mud. They had rolled him up and down on knobby pebbles. They had sat on him in a long line of 6. They had thumped him and bumped him till he could hardly breathe, and though he did not understand their language, he was almost sure that the names the Neolithic ladies called him were not ladylike. However, he said nothing till all the tribe of Tegamai were assembled, and then he led them back to the bank of the Wagai River, and there they found Taffy making daisy chains, and Tegamai carefully spearing small carp with his mended spear. "Well, you have been quick," said Taffy, "but why did you bring so many people? Daddy dear, this is my surprise. Are you surprised, Daddy?
Very, said Tegamai, but it has ruined all my fishing for the day. Why, the whole dear, kind, nice, clean, quiet tribe is here, Taffy.
And so they were.
First of all walked Teshumai Tewendro and the Neolithic ladies, tightly holding on to the stranger man, whose hair was full of mud, although he was a Tawara. Behind them came the head chief, the vice chief, the deputy and assistant chiefs, all armed to the upper teeth, the hetmans and heads of hundreds, platoffs with their platoons, and dolmens with their detachments, woons, negusses, and akuns ranking in the rear, still armed to the teeth. Behind them were the tribe in hierarchical order, from owners of 4 caves, 1 for each season, a private reindeer run, and 2 salmon leaps, to feudal and prognatus villains, semi-entitled to half a bearskin of winter nights, 7 yards from the fire, and adscript serfs, holding the reversion of a scraped marrowbone under Harriet. Aren't those beautiful words, best beloved? They were all there, prancing and shouting, and they frightened every fish for 20 miles, and Tegamai thanked them in a fluid Neolithic oration. Then Teshumai Tewendro ran down and kissed and hugged Taffy very much indeed. But the head chief of the tribe of Tegamai took Tegamai by the top knot letters and shook him severely. "Explain, explain, explain," cried all the tribe of Tegamai. "Goodness sakes alive," said Tegamai, "let go of my top knot. Can't a man break his carp spear without the whole countryside descending on him? You're a very interfering people."
"I don't believe you've brought my daddy's black-handled spear after all," said Taffy. "And what are you doing to my nice stranger man?"
They were thumping him by 2s and 3s and 10s, till his eyes turned round and round. He could only gasp and point at Taffy.
"Where are the bad people who speared you, my darling?" said Teshumai Tewendro.
"There aren't any," said Tegamai. "My only visitor this morning was the poor fellow that you're trying to choke. Aren't you well, or are you ill, O tribe of Tegamai?" "He came with a horrible picture," said the head chief, "a picture that showed you were full of spears."
Perhaps I'd better explain that I gave him that picture," said Taffy, but she did not feel quite comfy.
"You," said the tribe of Tegamai all together, "small person with no manners who ought to be spanked, you." "Taffy, dear, I'm afraid we're in for a little trouble," said her daddy, and put his arm round her, so she didn't care. "Explain, explain, explain," said the head chief of the tribe of Tegamai, and he hopped on 1 foot.
"I wanted the stranger man to fetch Daddy's spear, so I drawed it," said Taffy. "There wasn't lots of spears. There was only 1 spear. I drawed it 3 times to make sure. I couldn't help it looking as if it stuck into Daddy's head. There wasn't room on the birch bark, and those things that Mummy called bad people are my beavers. I drawed them to show him the way through the swamp, and I drawed Mummy at the mouth of the cave looking pleased, because he is a nice stranger man. And I think you are just the stupidest people in the world," said Taffy. "He is a very nice man. Why have you filled his hair with mud? Wash him."
Nobody said anything at all for a long time, till the head chief laughed. Then the stranger man, who was at least a Tawara, laughed. Then Tegamai laughed, till he fell down flat on the bank. Then all the tribe laughed more and worse and louder. The only people who did not laugh were Teshumai Tewendro and all the Neolithic ladies.